It is finally here, the first race data analysis episode for the 2022 season, taking a look at the data from the Bahrain Grand Prix of 2022. Now, if you're unfamiliar to this series and didn't catch any of my episodes for the last season of Formula 1, this is basically the series where I compile all of the lap times for each of the drivers and pit the teammates against each other to see exactly how well they have done against one another, as well as sort of give an overview of the general Grand Prix. Now, each team and segment of this video is all timestamped in the description down below, so please feel free to skip to whichever segment of the video you'd like me to talk about. But without further ado, let us jump on in to the race data, and we start with the very first positions table of 2022. Now, honestly, there really isn't too much change here. We have a lot of position switching at the first round of pit stops between lap 10 and 16, and then that's about it. There really isn't too much to go on from this positions table, with the majority of the top 10 actually staying fairly consistent throughout this entire Grand Prix. But if we turn our attention to the lap time chart for every single driver of this Grand Prix, we can see that safety car period at the very end, as well as 58 total pit stops. There were an enormous amount of pit stops this Grand Prix, with some as early as lap 10 and then some as late as lap 50. But if we take a slightly more zoomed in look at the overall lap times, we can still see that there are distinct bands of racing, highlighted here by these three blue arrows. Now, these bands of racing are something I spoke about a lot last year, where we essentially have the top couple of teams, we then have the midfield, and then we have the backpack as well. And very occasionally we have the midfield split up into two, and then again very occasionally it splits up into three. So usually we see three distinct bands, and then very occasionally we see 4 or 5. Now, the hope for this year was to bring everybody closer, but if we take a look back at the lap chart, we can see that hasn't really happened. There are still 3 distinct bands of racing throughout this entire Grand Prix, where there is a large pace disparity between the top runners, the midfield, and then the back markers as well. But now what we'll do is we'll go over the overall clean air lap analysis for each of these drivers, where I've isolated the lap times that they set in clean air. Now, a clean air lap for any of these drivers was a lap time that was set outside of 1.5 seconds of the car in front, as we've clearly seen so far with this Grand Prix in Bahrain that the cars are able to follow much more closely without losing an awful lot of downforce. So I felt that 1.5 seconds is actually fair compared to the 2.5 to 3 seconds that we were selecting last year. Now, I'm still working on some of these tables as time really is against me at the moment, but we do have these stint breakdowns which we'll go over right now. So for stint number 1, we have people running the soft compound and then also the 2 McLarens running the mediums, and it was the 2 Ferraris who were comfortably clear of everybody else on the soft tyre, with Leclerc half a second quicker in clean air than Carlos Sainz. Where Leclerc had 8 clean air laps, Sainz had 6, the same with Verstappen. However, if we take a look at the gradient column, we can see that everybody is actually losing time in their stints, apart from Nicholas Latifi, who only had 2 clean air laps and went a little bit quicker. Now, this is something that we're going to see an awful lot of when we take a look at the team breakdowns. But if I now take a look at stint number 2, where we actually had drivers running the softs, mediums and hards, it's once again the 2 Ferraris that are well in front of everybody else, with Max Verstappen sort of closing in on the 2 Ferraris. It's still Leclerc leading Sainz by 2.5 tenths, Verstappen 4.5 tenths back, and then we go to Magnussen at 1.3 seconds back. Whereas if we turn our attention to the medium running, it's Sergio Perez in the Red Bull 1.1 seconds quicker than Pierre Gasly, where we then get the hard runners of the 2 Mercedes and Lando Norris, the 2 Mercedes comfortably quicker than the struggling McLarens. But once again, looking at the gradient columns, everybody is losing time. Now, focusing our attention over to stint number 3, where once again a lot of people ran the soft, medium and hards, it is again the Red Bulls and the Ferraris that top this list. But interestingly, on the mediums it was Verstappen who was quicker than Leclerc this time, and again one of the only drivers to improve their lap times over their 15 clean air laps. Whereas taking a look at the hard compound runners this time, again there is a large disparity between Gasly and Ocon, and then Alonso and Ricciardo. Now Daniel Ricciardo can be forgiven for being a little bit off the pace for this Grand Prix, as he didn't actually do any of the testing days due to catching COVID, so he's never actually ran a full race distance in one of these cars, especially at the competitive Grand Prix, so him being a little bit off the pace is completely understandable for this race. But very unusually, we actually have an awful lot of 4 stint runners, with everybody at the end of the Grand Prix actually running the soft compound of tyre, where we have the 2 Ferraris comfortably quicker than the 2 Mercedes, who again were comfortably quicker than the rest of the midfield. So it seems like the Red Bulls and the Ferraris are the 2 top teams for this year, with Mercedes a comfortable 3rd, and then the midfield is going to chop and change very dramatically. But again, taking a look at the gradients, there aren't very many people actually improving, apart from Guan Yu Zhou across his 3 clean air laps. Now admittedly, the final 4th stint of this race wasn't particularly long, as a lot of people just shod the soft compound of tyre for the remaining 10 or 15 laps. And so with the race data overview all done and dusted, with the basic clean air lap analysis all done too, we're going to take a look at each of the teams. We're going in 2021 Constructors' Championship order, so we're going to start with Mercedes and end with Haas. Now I will be explaining each of the graphs that pop up in this video in the Mercedes section, so if you are new to this series, then let's jump on into Mercedes. So on screen now is the Mercedes panel. We have their lap time chart in the top left, with Lewis Hamilton in the black line and George Russell in the turquoise. Then directly below that we have the Mercedes gaps chart, which denotes the gap in seconds between each of the 2 drivers. We then have their positions chart in the top right, and then finally their percentage pace difference in the bottom right. Now this percentage pace difference graph will take all of Lewis Hamilton's lap times, will divide them all by George Russell's, and convert them to a percentage. Any percentage that is greater than 0 is where Lewis Hamilton is going quicker, and then any percentage that is lower than 0 is where George Russell is going quicker. These percentages are then ordered from largest down to smallest, and then we end up with the distribution that is shown on screen. And what we can do with this is we can split this down the middle, and we can say that for 52.6% of the laps, George Russell was actually the quicker of the 2 Mercedes, and therefore for 47.4% it was Lewis Hamilton. But if we turn our attention to the lap time chart overall, for stint number 1, the gap was hovering at around 5 seconds quite comfortably in Hamilton's favour. But we can see that the cars are actually losing time. They lose a second from the start of the stint in the 1:39 39s to where they end the stint in the 1:40 40s. And this is again visualised in the second stint, where they're in the 1:38 38s and then dip into the 1:39 39s. But once again the gap hovers at around 5 seconds, but slowly coming down in Hamilton's favour. They then have a small change in positions just here in between the 2 stints as they came into the pits at different laps. And then finally stint number 3, they are actually dead even, with the gap hovering almost consistently at 15 seconds for around 10 laps. But if we take a closer look at the Mercedes clean air lap breakdown, we can see that Hamilton across the full race distance on the table on the right was around half a second quicker than George Russell across the whole Grand Prix, where Hamilton had 27 clean air laps and George Russell had 32, and both only just had a negative gradient, so they improved very slightly across the whole Grand Prix distance. And we can see with the clean air lap distribution across each of the 4 quarters of the Grand Prix, they actually had very similar levels of clean air laps in the first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, and then the final quarter. But if we turn our attention to the stint 1, 2, 3, and 4 breakdowns, this is where we see the tyres dropping off significantly, as there was never a negative gradient in each of the individual stints. But once again, apart from stint number 1, it was always Hamilton that was ahead of George Russell, with the CL column denoting the number of clean air laps in the stint, with the SL column being the overall stint length, and then this is converted to a percentage just to the right of this. But from Mercedes, we'll now take a look at Red Bull, with the battle between Sergio Perez in the dark blue line and Max Verstappen in the light blue. Starting with their percentage pace difference, we can split this down the middle, and for 53.7% of the Grand Prix, it was actually Perez who had the faster of the lap times, and therefore for 46%, it was Max Verstappen. And this is actually one of the very few times that this has happened in their teammate pairing. But looking at their overall lap time chart, we can clearly see a negative gradient in the lap times in all 4 of the Red Bull stints. But we can see a significant advantage in favour of Max Verstappen, especially in this first stint, rising the gap to almost 10 seconds. Stint number 2, it's a little bit more even, with the gap sort of hovering at 10 seconds, but stint number 3, again, fairly even, around 16 seconds at the gap, and then the very short stint 4, especially for the 2 Red Bulls as they retired slightly early, they were again dead even. But taking a closer look at the Red Bull clean air lap breakdown, it was Verstappen who was just a 10th faster than Sergio Perez, so a very close teammate pairing, with 31 clean air laps for Verstappen and 33 for Perez. Again, both drivers had a negative gradient over the whole race distance. And equally, their distribution was fairly even across the 4 quarters of the Grand Prix. But looking at the overall stint breakdown, on stint number 2, Sergio Perez was actually the quicker driver on the medium compound of tyre compared to Verstappen on the softs. Where stint number 3, Red Bull were actually able to improve their lap times across their whole stint, but only just. But moving away from Red Bull, we'll now turn our attention to Ferrari. And splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 28.1% of the Grand Prix, it was Carlos Sainz in the black line who was the faster of the Ferrari pairs, and therefore for 71.9%, it was Charles Leclerc who was setting the fastest lap times. And in stint number 1, this was where their greatest difference was. It was roughly half a second between the 2 drivers, as the gap rose to 10 seconds before the first pit stop phase by lap 10. But again, much like the Red Bull graph, we can see a massive drop-off in lap time with the tyre degradation. However, in stint number 2, Carlos Sainz actually bucks up his ideas, and the gap stays at 10 seconds for around 15 or so laps. But again, a very significant tyre drop-off. And in stint number 3, the tyre drop-off was a little bit more manageable, as the cars were significantly lighter as they had no fuel. So they could be significantly kinder on the tyres through all of the corners. And once again, the gap was staying at around 18 seconds through stint number 3. But in stint number 4, the gap opened back up again, as Leclerc was able to go around a second a lap quicker than Carlos Sainz. But taking a look at the Ferrari clean air lap breakdown, Leclerc was half a second quicker across the whole race distance than Carlos Sainz, with 40 clean air laps out of 57 compared to Carlos Sainz's 36. And once again, a very similar distribution across the 4 quarters. And we can see that Leclerc's biggest margins over Carlos Sainz were in stint number 1, where the gap was at half a second, and at stint number 4, where it was at 0.8 of a second between the 2 drivers. Whereas in stint number 2 and stint number 3, they were fairly even, with just around 0.2 splitting the 2 cars. And so from Ferrari, we'll now move to 4th place team, McLaren. And unfortunately, McLaren really did struggle in this Grand Prix, but splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 50.9% of the race, it was Daniel Ricciardo in the blue who was setting the faster lap times, and therefore for 49.1%, it was Lando Norris. Now, McLaren really did struggle and very much underperformed in this Grand Prix, and in stint number 1, they were actually fairly even, setting relatively inconsistent lap times overall, but the gap was staying between 5 and 2 seconds. However, when Daniel Ricciardo pitted just a couple of laps before Lando Norris, we can see a large 2-second per lap difference between the 2 cars, where he is able to reduce the gap significantly from 20 seconds down to 5 before Lando Norris actually came in for his pit stop. But the positions swapped once again when Ricciardo made his second pit stop in the Grand Prix, but again the lap times were very inconsistent from the 2 McLarens, and not really showing any of the tyre drop-off that we have seen from the Ferraris, the Red Bulls or the Mercedes team. And taking a look at the McLaren clean air lap breakdown overall, across the whole race distance it was actually Ricciardo who was a bit quicker than Lando Norris. However, they were significantly slower than everybody else, with Norris running in the 1:40 across his 19 clean air laps, with interestingly neither driver having any clean air laps in the first quarter of the Grand Prix, then having very similar amounts for the final 3 quarters. But if we take a look at the stint breakdown on the left, we can see that Norris did actually have the controlling pace over Daniel Ricciardo. It's just he set some clean air laps in the first stint, unlike Daniel Ricciardo, which pulls down his full race average. But once again, we can see that they all have positive gradients apart from Daniel Ricciardo's stint number 4, where the tyres do drop off, it's just not as significant as the other 3 teams. Then from McLaren, we'll take a look at Alpine, and we can split their percentage pace difference down the middle, and we can see that for 68.4% of the Grand Prix it was Esteban Ocon in the white who was the faster of the 2 cars, and therefore for 31.6% it was Fernando Alonso in the dark blue. Now again, Alpine had a very funny Grand Prix, much the same as their 2021 year, where in stint number 1 it was Ocon who was a little bit quicker than Fernando Alonso, even though Alonso was the car in front, with the gap actually opening up in stint number 2 and in stint number 3, where there was a large half a second to 1 second per lap difference between the 2 Alpines. But taking a look at Alpine's clean air lap breakdown overall, across the whole race distance there was a half a second difference in Ocon's favour, and looking at the distribution across the 4 quarters, it was fairly even in each of the stages of this race. The only time that Alonso actually had an advantage over Ocon was in stint number 1 on the softs. However, each driver only had 1 or 2 clean air laps for an 11 or 14 lap stint. Now Alpine was one of those teams like McLaren that didn't show much of a tyre drop-off, however it was there, especially in stint number 4 where they have significantly positive gradients, where across the final 3 stints on all 3 tyre compounds, Alonso was roughly 6/10 slower than Esteban Ocon. Then moving away from Alpine, we'll take a look at Alfa Tauri, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for exactly 25% of the laps set, Yuki Tsunoda was going quicker, and therefore for 75% it was Pierre Gasly in the black who was going quicker. And once again, in a similar manner to Red Bull, we can see a significant tyre drop-off for the 2 AlphaTauris in stint number 1 and in stint number 2, where the gap was always in Pierre Gasly's favour by around 1/10 to 2/10 per lap. However, in stint number 3, much like the Ferraris, the tyres actually don't really degrade too much, as the cars are significantly lighter, and the gap actually stays at 10 seconds, with Yuki Tsunoda being able to match Pierre Gasly. And taking a look at their clean air lap analysis, they both set 28 clean air laps across this whole Grand Prix distance, with very similar distributions across the 4 quarters, with Tsunoda having just a couple more in the first quarter to Pierre Gasly. However, if we take a look at their 3 stints that they actually set, as neither did a stint 4, we see that Pierre Gasly always kept significant tabs on Yuki Tsunoda. But once again, in a very similar manner to Ferrari, we can see a significant positive gradient for the first 2 stints, and a less significant positive gradient, and even a negative gradient for Yuki Tsunoda in stint number 3. Then from AlphaTauri, we will take a look at Aston Martin, and we can split their percentage pace difference down the middle, and we can see that for 63.2% of the Grand Prix, it was Lance Stroll in the lime green who was the faster of the 2 cars, and therefore for 36.8% it was Sebastian Vettel in the dark green. Now again, Aston Martin, much like McLaren, had a bit of a struggling Grand Prix, where it was Lance Stroll who was a little bit quicker than Sebastian Vettel and actually performing an on-track overtake as opposed to a pit stop overtake, where he was roughly 3/10 quicker in stint number 1, where once again we can see a very slight positive gradient. Where in stint number 2, we can actually see that Sebastian Vettel in the dark green line had 2 sort of very slow laps. Whether these were for blue flags or mistakes, I'm not 100% sure, but there is a slightly more positive gradient here for stint number 2, as they started in the 1:39s and ended close to 1:41. And then for the final stint number 4, we can see that Lance Stroll was actually significantly quicker than Sebastian Vettel, rising the gap from 10 seconds at lap 48 almost to 20 seconds at the end of the Grand Prix. And taking a look at their clean air lap breakdown across the whole Grand Prix distance, it was Stroll who had a 1.1 second advantage over Sebastian Vettel. And looking at the quarter distribution, it was again very, very similar, with the two closest stints between the two drivers coming in stint number 2 and in stint number 3, where the gap was in 2 seconds in Stroll's favour. Where stint number 1, he actually had a second advantage in clean air over Sebastian Vettel and a 3-second advantage in stint number 4. However, this isn't super representative as Vettel only set 1 clean air lap out of a 13-lap stint. Then from Aston Martin, we'll take a look at Williams, who once again had a bit of a funny Grand Prix. Splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 66.7%, 2/3 of the Grand Prix distance, Alex Albon in the white set the faster lap time, and therefore for 1/3 of the Grand Prix, it was Latifi in the dark blue. And much like Aston Martin, they were very even in the first stint, but again a clear positive gradient can be observed, which is much the same in stint number 2, where the gap was staying between 5 and 10 seconds for around half of this Grand Prix distance. But it wasn't until stint number 3 that Alex Albon was actually able to open up the gap, where for around 5 or 6 laps he was a second per lap quicker than Nicholas Latifi. With Williams' clean air lap breakdown looking a bit like this: 35 laps across the whole Grand Prix distance for Albon compared to 32 for Latifi, with a 3.5 advantage towards Alex Albon. Where the biggest advantage in Albon's favour came in stint number 1 at 1.2 seconds and stint number 3 at 0.9 seconds. But once again, much like all of the teams that we've looked at so far, they all had significant positive gradients to their lap times, apart from Latifi in stint number 1. Then penultimately, for the data analysis video of the Bahrain Grand Prix of 2022, we will take a look at Alfa Romeo. And splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 52.6% of the Grand Prix, it was Guan Yu Zhao who was setting the faster lap times for Alfa Romeo, compared to 47.4% for Valtteri Bottas. Where stint number 1 for Alfa Romeo went rather well, they didn't really demonstrate too much of a tyre drop-off compared to the teams that we've looked at so far. However, their lap times were rather inconsistent. However, the tyre drop-off comes at stint number 2, where it's actually Guan Yu Zhao who's a little bit more consistent than Valtteri Bottas. However, there is a significant 1-second tyre drop-off between the start of the stint and the end of the stint. Where once again in stint number 3, Guan Yu Zhao closes down the gap to Valtteri Bottas from 10 seconds down to 5 just when the safety car is called out. Where taking a look at Alfa Romeo's clean air lap analysis, we can see a large disparity in their quarter distribution, where Bottas set 6 of his laps in the opening quarter, and then Guan Yu Zhao set 10 of his laps in the second quarter compared to Valtteri Bottas's 1. So the overall full race breakdown isn't going to be super accurate for the Alfa Romeo pairing. But if we take a look at stint number 2 and stint number 3, it's actually Guan Yu Zhao who is quicker than Valtteri Bottas, and quite significantly, by 0.4 in stint 2 and 1 second in stint 3. And then finally, for the data analysis video of the 2022 Bahrain Grand Prix, we will take a look at Haas, and we'll split their percentage pace difference down the middle, and we can see that for 75.4% of this Grand Prix, Kevin Magnussen in the grey was the faster of the two Haases, and therefore for 24.6% it was Mick Schumacher. Now, I understand that Mick Schumacher was spun around in the opening lap, which put him all the way at the back of the Grand Prix. However, having such a significant pace difference in stint number 1 at a second per lap to Kevin Magnussen is very, very significant. And then again in stint number 2, we can see that Magnussen is very, very smooth compared to Mick Schumacher, who is setting a couple of inconsistent lap times. But once again, we can see a clear visualization of the tyre degradation of this year, where the gap actually rises from 20 seconds at the start of stint 2 all the way up to 35 seconds when they come in for their third pit stop. And then at stint number 3, it is actually much more even, with the gap staying consistently at 40 seconds towards the end of the Grand Prix when the safety car is called out. where then right at the very end when the safety car comes in, there is a 2-second per lap deficit between Magnussen and Schumacher, where the gap rises from around 1 second all the way up to 15 at the checkered flag. And so finally, looking at the clean air lap analysis for Haas, they actually set fairly representative laps, and especially looking at their quarter distribution, it was very, very even, with a 6.5 difference in Magnussen's favour against Mick Schumacher, with stint number 2 and stint number 3 being the most representative sessions for comparisons between these two drivers, where the gap was almost 0.8 in Magnussen's favour in stint 2 and half a second in stint 3. And there we go, there is the first data analysis video all concluded for the Bahrain Grand Prix of 2022, the first race of this 2022 season. Now, if you have liked this video as well as any others that you find on my channel and you feel like you want to support the channel financially, there are a few options. You could become a member of the YouTube channel by hitting the blue join button next to the red subscribe button, in which you'll gain access to exclusive badges and emojis to use in the comments section. Or if you want to have access to videos early before they release here on YouTube, you could subscribe to my Patreon. There is a link to that in the description down below, in addition to having a Patreon donation link where you could make just a one-off donation. And then each subscriber to the channel memberships or to Patreon will receive a small little shout out at the end of the video. A big thanks goes to Elliot Crosson for their continued support on Patreon. Now, if you guys have any suggestions for improvements for this series, any other bits of data analysis that you would like to see, then please do let me know in the comments down below. But that is all I've got for you today. I hope you have enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys then.